Hello everyone, I wish you all a wonderful day. After a long rainy night, Toan and Tu Diem suddenly discover strange footprints leading straight into their yard and toward the firewood shelter they built yesterday. Did someone secretly enter their farm during the night? Now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together to find out what really happened. Will they face a real danger tonight, or is it only a misunderstanding? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. After a long night of rain, the morning on the farm was still covered in a soft grey tone. Drops of water remained on the old tin roof and occasionally fell down with the steady tapping sound. The damp, cold air slipped through the small gaps of the house, carrying the smell of wet soil and crushed grass after the night rain. Tu Diem was the first to wake up. She was used to rising early to light the stove and prepare breakfast before the sun fully appeared. As she stepped onto the porch, she gently pulled her thin scarf closer around her neck and looked toward the pile of firewood under the small shelter that the two of them had built yesterday. The metal roof was still there, but when she looked more carefully, she noticed that several logs near the outer edge were lying slightly out of place. At first, Tu Diem thought the night wind might have rolled them away, but when she walked closer, she noticed that one of the metal roofing sheets had shifted slightly to the side, as if someone had touched it. She bent down and placed her hand on the outer log. The mud was still fresh, soft, and not yet dry. That meant the disturbance must have happened after the rain had already slowed. She remained still for a few seconds before turning back into the house to call Toan. Toan had just woken up and was still putting on his jacket when he heard Tu Diem calling from the yard. He stepped onto the porch and followed the direction of her hand. The two of them stood beside the woodpile for a moment without speaking. Then Toan crouched down and examined the ground. The soft mud in the yard clearly showed unfamiliar footprints. They were not Tu Diem's sandals, and they were not his shoes either. The prints were larger, pressed deeply into the mud, and stretched from the gate toward the woodpile. Toan slowly followed the muddy trail with careful eyes. He noticed that several of the driest logs had been moved slightly away from their original position, as if someone had lifted them to search beneath them. Tu Diem stood behind him, watching every movement he made. Inside her chest, a quiet feeling of unease slowly began to grow. The two of them walked back into the kitchen to check the tools. When Tu Diem looked toward the corner near the door, she suddenly realized that the firewood chopping knife was not where it had been before. The day before, she clearly remembered placing it beside the water barrel. They searched around the area for a moment. Finally, Toan discovered the knife lying near the water jar outside the porch, tilted on the ground as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. That small detail made the atmosphere between them feel heavier. Toan decided to check the fence behind the garden. He walked along the narrow dirt path slowly and carefully. When he reached the far end of the yard, he saw that the wooden gate was slightly open. The simple rope that had tied it shut had slipped loose. On the wet ground, there was still a streak of muddy footprints passing through the opening. Toan stood there silently for a few seconds before letting out a slow breath. When he turned around, he saw that Tu Diem had followed him without him noticing. She did not ask anything, but the look in her eyes showed she already understood what he was thinking. It was possible that someone had entered their yard during the night. Both of them returned to the house quietly. Tu Diem tried to light the stove to boil water, but because her mind was distracted, the flame flickered unevenly. Meanwhile, Toan brought a hoe outside to fix the loosened fence. Even so, he kept turning his head to look around, as if trying to catch any unusual sound. Just then, a loud noise suddenly came from behind the house. A plastic pot used for growing vegetables had been knocked over by the wind and hit the ground. The unexpected sound startled both of them. Toan quickly stepped outside to check. When he realized it was only the fallen pot, he lightly shook his head, although his face still did not appear completely relaxed. While lifting the pot back up, he noticed another footprint near the vegetable bed. This footprint seemed to stop there for quite some time, as if someone had stood quietly observing the house before leaving. That discovery made Toan begin thinking more seriously about the safety of the farm. The morning continued passing with a strange mixture of routine work and quiet uneasiness. Tu Diem tried to return to her usual tasks. She rinsed the logs that had been moved into the kitchen and wiped away the remaining mud at their base. Then she stacked them neatly near the stove so they would be easier to use later. Those small tasks helped calm her mind slightly, yet her eyes still often drifted toward the yard where the unfamiliar footprints remained visible in the mud. Around mid-morning, Toan arrived carrying a basket of vegetables and several eggs. When she heard about the strange footprints, her expression immediately changed. She quietly said that during the past few days, several households in the village had complained about missing gardening tools. One family had lost a shovel left outside the porch, while another had lost an entire roll of electric wire. No one knew exactly when it happened because the rain had caused people to close their doors earlier than usual. Not long afterward, Uncle Lam also stopped by. He lived nearby and often came over to check on them. After hearing the story, he remembered that the dogs in the village had barked for quite a long time near the end of the dirt road the night before. Because the rain was heavy, no one went outside to investigate. Uncle Lam's story made the atmosphere grow even more tense. Toan decided that after lunch he would walk around the land to examine the area more carefully. He wanted to make sure no one was hiding nearby or planning to return. Tu Diem wanted to go with him, but he told her to stay near the house for safety. Even so, she quietly followed him for a short distance. When they reached the back of the garden, Toan discovered an old sack caught on the base of a tree. The sack was torn and covered with mud. Looking closely, it seemed like something someone might have carried before accidentally dropping it. Nearby, there was also a small wheel mark pressed into the mud, possibly from a handcart or a small pushcart. These traces made Toan even more certain that someone had wandered around their land during the night. As they were walking back, Tu Diem suddenly slipped on the muddy ground. Toan reacted instantly and grabbed her hand before she could fall. The two of them remained still for several seconds until she regained her balance. That small moment made Toan feel even more concerned about her safety during these rainy days. When they returned to the yard, both of them began moving the tools inside the house. Toan checked the metal sheets on the shelter roof again and tightened the ropes holding them down. While working, he noticed that the steel wire roll he had bought the day before seemed to have been pulled out slightly. Not much, but enough for him to realize that someone had touched it. Noon slowly approached. The sky was still gray, but the rain paused for a while. Tu Diem prepared a simple pot of vegetable soup. The two of them ate lunch quietly. From time to time, Toan glanced toward the yard, where the footprints still remained on the muddy ground, like a reminder that something unusual had happened during the night. The afternoon began slowly. Toan returned with Thu to see if everything was all right. Both of them advised Toan to secure the gate more carefully and perhaps ask some neighbors to keep an eye on the land at night. The idea made Toan feel slightly more reassured. While they were still talking, a rustling sound suddenly came from the shelter. Everyone immediately turned their heads. Toan grabbed a wooden stick and stepped outside. After a few tense seconds, a stray dog suddenly ran out from the firewood pile. Around its neck hung a broken rope. Everyone breathed out in relief, yet that small detail made Toan wonder whether someone nearby might be searching for a lost animal. The afternoon ended with many unanswered questions. When Tu Diem began preparing dinner, light rain started falling again. Toan stood on the porch looking across the yard, his eyes still fixed on the shelter and the firewood pile that had just been rebuilt. Deep inside, he understood that if there truly was a stranger wandering around the land, tonight might be the moment they returned. The afternoon slowly moved toward the end of the day. The rain was no longer as heavy as it had been in the morning, but droplets still fell steadily on the tin roof, creating a familiar sound across the small yard. Tu Diem stood in the kitchen, gently washing the vegetables that Toan had brought earlier. The water in the basin trembled slightly whenever a drop of rain fell from the edge of the roof. Even though her hands continued working calmly, her eyes occasionally looked out toward the yard where the metal shelter and the firewood pile rested quietly beneath the grey sky. Toan sat on a wooden chair near the door, holding a small knife and trimming several bamboo sticks that he planned to use as door latches. He worked carefully, but every now and then he raised his head and glanced toward the gate. The strange footprints and the moved objects from the morning still lingered in his thoughts. After a while, Tu Diem placed a pot of water on the stove. The fire quickly caught the dry firewood that had been brought inside the day before. A thin trail of smoke rose upward, carrying the familiar scent of burning wood. She watched the flame for a moment before quietly telling Toan that at least the new shelter had managed to keep the firewood dry. Without it, with rain lasting this long, preparing dinner tonight would have been very difficult. Toan nodded. He set the knife down on the table and walked out to the porch. From there, he could clearly see both the gate and the shelter. The small yard was quiet, filled only with the light sound of rain and the soft movement of leaves in the wind. Dinner was prepared quite simply: a pot of vegetable soup, a plate of fried eggs, and some boiled greens. When the two of them sat down to eat, the kitchen felt warmer thanks to the fire from the wood stove. Even so, both of them ate slowly. Whenever a sound came from outside, their eyes immediately turned toward the door. Just as Toan placed his bowl on the table, a soft knocking sound came from the metal roof outside the porch. It was not rain. The sound was dry and clear. Toan immediately stood up and stepped outside. Tu Diem followed a few steps behind him. When he shined the flashlight toward the roof, they saw a long tree branch that the wind had blown against the metal sheet. Toan pulled the branch away and returned, giving Tu Diem a small reassuring smile that it was only the wind. After dinner, Tu Diem began cleaning the kitchen. Toan carried several more pieces of firewood into the house in case the rain became heavier during the night. Outside, the rain had grown lighter, but the sky remained dark and heavy. After a while, the light bulb in the kitchen flickered suddenly and then went out completely. The electrical wires were likely damp after several days of rain. The house fell into darkness for a few seconds. Tu Diem stood still, holding a bowl that she had not yet placed down. Toan quickly took the oil lamp from the wooden shelf they had built the day before. When the small flame of the lamp lit up, a warm yellow light spread across the kitchen. The two of them sat on the wooden bench beneath the porch. They did not talk much. The soft rain and the gentle glow of the oil lamp made the space quieter than usual. Yet that silence also made every sound outside much clearer. Near midnight, the dogs in the village suddenly began barking one after another. The barking came from different directions and gradually stretched into a long, tense chorus. Toan immediately lifted his head. He signaled Tu Diem to stay quiet and dimmed the light inside the house. After a moment, they heard very soft footsteps in the yard. The sound of mud being stepped on was slow and damp. Toan stood up, holding the flashlight in one hand and the wooden stick in the other. Tu Diem remained behind the door, her heart beating quickly. Both of them stared toward the shelter where the firewood was stacked neatly. In the dim light of the night, a shadow appeared near the shelter. The person bent down slightly, as if checking something beneath the metal sheets. Toan stepped forward and turned on the flashlight. The bright beam shone directly onto the stranger. The man quickly turned around in surprise. He raised his hand slightly, as if wanting to explain immediately. When Toan looked more closely, he recognized that the man lived in the fields across the dirt road. The man caught his breath and explained that he had been searching for his missing cow since the afternoon. While walking through the area, he saw the new shelter and thought the animal might have wandered here to escape the rain. The rope in his hand also explained the broken rope they had earlier seen hanging from the stray dog's neck. Toan slowly lowered the wooden stick. The tense air instantly softened. Tu Diem stepped outside as well. After a short conversation, the man thanked them and continued walking down the dirt road to keep searching for his animal. When the man disappeared into the light rain, Toan looked around the yard once more. Even though the stranger had turned out not to be a thief, the footprints from the morning and the moved wire still did not seem fully explained. Not long afterward, Uncle Lam and two other neighbors arrived, as they had promised earlier in the day. They carried flashlights and walked around the land to check the area. After examining the gate, the fence and the garden, they found no additional suspicious signs. Everyone sat together under the porch for a while, drinking warm water. Uncle Lam said that during long rainy days like these, the families in the village should help keep watch for one another. If anyone saw a stranger wandering nearby, they only needed to call out loudly, and the nearby houses would hear. Those simple words made the atmosphere feel lighter. After the neighbors left, Toan remained standing on the porch, looking into the dark yard. The metal shelter still stood firmly above the firewood pile. Rainwater ran down the edge of the metal sheets in thin streams. Tu Diem stepped beside him. She looked toward the fire still glowing inside the stove and quietly said that at least today they had managed to keep the firewood dry and cook a warm dinner. Toan nodded. He said that tomorrow he would rebuild the gate more securely and add another lock to the back door. The two of them stood quietly for a moment. The rain slowly became lighter, leaving only occasional drops falling from the roof to the ground. In the dim light of the oil lamp, the small house and the newly built shelter looked more peaceful than they had in the morning, filled with worry. Toan let out a quiet breath. He knew that life on the farm would still bring many rainy days, many concerns, and many tasks ahead. But when he looked at Tu Diem standing beside him, he understood that all those things would always feel easier when they faced them together.
Sau một đêm mưa dài, buổi sáng trên trang trại của Toan và Tu Diem bắt đầu bằng một phát hiện bất thường. Những dấu chân lạ xuất hiện trên nền bùn, dẫn từ cổng vào đến gần đống củi dưới mái che mới dựng. Một vài khúc củi bị xê dịch và chiếc dao bổ củi cũng không còn ở vị trí cũ, khiến cả hai bắt đầu lo lắng. Trong ngày hôm đó, Toan kiểm tra quanh khu đất và phát hiện thêm nhiều dấu vết đáng nghi. Từ Phan và chú Lâm ghé qua kể rằng gần đây trong làng cũng có vài nhà bị mất trộm cộ. Khi trời tối và cơn mưa lại rơi nhẹ, một bóng người bất ngờ xuất hiện gần đống củi, khiến Toan và Tu Diem căng thẳng. Nhưng cuối cùng họ phát hiện đó chỉ là một người hàng xóm đang đi tìm con bò bị lạc.